Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tracy Glab, the Executive Director of the FIA, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to your FIA and to tonight's Sheppy Dog Fund Lecture. Tonight, we have Dr. Griffith Mann with us for the third time for a presentation on Unicorns and Heroes, John D. Rockefeller Jr. and the Tapestry at the Met Cloisters. And I say third time because it's a great compliment. Dr. Klein, who sponsors our lectures, he only asks back people who he really likes. So it's a very good compliment that you're back. And it's not the same subject. He's done 2 different subjects. If you're interested, those are on our YouTube channel, and you can check those out. The Sheppy Dog Fund Lecture Series was established in 2012 by Dr. Alan Klein to address the topics of art, religion, and history prior to the 19th century. Thank you, Dr. Klein, for continuing to bring these wonderful lectures to the FIA. And I would like to remind you that there's more Sheppy Dog Fund lectures on their way. There's a 2-part lecture coming up on June 1st and June 8th with Dr. Justin Sledge delivering a talk on the Tree of Life. So it's sure to please. I think he always gives great lectures. Before we bring tonight's guest, Dr. Mann, to the stage, as always, we'd like to take the opportunity to thank the citizens of Genesee County for the Genesee County Arts, Education, and Cultural Enrichment Millage, which provides free entry to the FIA for Genesee County citizens. Thank you. Yeah, they deserve applause, absolutely. And I would like to thank the Ford Foundation Equity Fund of the Community Foundation of Greater Flint for making the ASL interpretation possible. Now, please take a moment to silence your electronic devices. Before I introduce the speaker, I just want to have a little plug for the Cloisters. It's my favorite museum to go to in New York City. It's a little hard to get to. It's not his fault. You'll find out why in this lecture. But it's worth the $25 cab ride or whatever it is, or very, very long subway. Just bring a book. It's great. It's great to go to. I try to go every time I go to New York when I can make the time. And I guess the benefit of being off the beaten path, it's not like crowded like when you go to the Metropolitan on Fifth Avenue. So it's a little less crowded, and you can enjoy the gardens and the art, and it's a magical place. Dr. Griffith Mann is the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Michel David-Weill Curator in charge of the Department of Medieval Art and the Met Cloisters. Dr. Mann received his BA in Art History and History from Williams College and his Ph.D. in Medieval Art from Johns Hopkins University. A specialist in the arts of late medieval Italy, he has published on civic patronage, painting, and devotion in Tuscany. Everyone, please join me in a warm Flint welcome for Dr. Griffith Mann.
First, just a mic test to make sure that's up and running. Give me a thumbs up there. That's great. I'm going to turn this one off. Swing it over there. So I'm just going to take one moment to get myself some water, get situated. But thank you very much, Tracy, for that generous introduction. It's really a pleasure to be back. This is the third time that I've done this talk, as Tracy said, but the first time was actually at the height of the pandemic. So I was broadcasting, so to speak, from the Cloisters itself, and it was really a pleasure to have a chance to be here in person last year and again this year on a beautiful spring day. I want to thank everyone for turning out to hear tonight's talk, and I hope that it provides you with some incentive, and Tracy, thank you for the plug, to come see the Cloisters, because it really is a magical place, and I hope you come away with some sense of appreciation for why at least I feel that way. And Tracy, I'm glad you do too. All right, so my talk is organized more or less in 3 parts. The first part really offers you with some insights into why the Cloisters came to be what it is, why it is where it is, and how it came to be created. The second is to take some of the characters that come out of that early story and to tell you how they're connected to the story of the Unicorn Tapestries, which, if there is a destination object at the Cloisters or group of objects, it's probably the Unicorn Tapestries. And then the third is to take a look at a second set of really important tapestries that are also at the Cloisters, referred to as the Heroes Tapestries, which were created about 100 years earlier, so about 1400. The Unicorn Tapestries were created around the year 1500. And to share with you some of the recent work that we're doing to conserve these tapestries, which is hopefully a little behind-the-scenes peek that you'll get the benefit of seeing what we're up to now with some of the holdings of the museum. So for those armchair travelers out there, the Cloisters is located on the northern tip of the island of Manhattan. It's, in fact, if you're driving up the West Side Highway, it's the last exit before you get off the island of Manhattan. And it stands on this promontory that overlooks views of the Hudson River. It's one of the highest natural points on the island of Manhattan. Obviously, the island's been significantly built up since Europeans arrived there, but in terms of its natural topography, the Cloisters really occupies this long ridge that goes along the west side of the island of Manhattan. So it offers these sweeping views out over the Palisades, across the Hudson River, and the Hudson River itself. When you enter the Cloisters, one of the core ideas behind the founders was that you would really be transported in time and place. So you get these views of a building that looks much older than anything around it. It is a purpose-built modern museum, as you'll hear about, that first opened in this site in 1938, but it incorporated physical elements of medieval buildings, architectural elements that were connected to places like monasteries, hence the name the Cloisters, which is that covered walkway that you often find at the very heart of a medieval monastery. And it's in fact that legacy that still lives on today in things like college campuses, where you often had a quad as organizing the center of the campus. The Unicorn Tapestries probably are best represented by this iconic image of the unicorn in the garden, where the unicorn itself is resting in this enclosed garden space beneath what's a pomegranate tree. And the other set of tapestries that you'll hear about are the Heroes Tapestries. Both of these have strong connections to John D. Rockefeller Jr. In the case of the Unicorn Tapestries, he was their original American owner of the tapestries before they were given to the Cloisters. And then he funded the purchase of the Heroes Tapestries after the Cloisters opened in the location that I just showed you. But I'd like to take a moment to step back in time and talk a little bit about how the Cloisters actually came to be. Because Rockefeller, although he's certainly an early participant in the story, is not the first person that's essential to know about to understand why and how the Cloisters came to be what it is today in New York. So two key players that I want to introduce at the very beginning of the talk. John D. Rockefeller Jr., seen on the left in that image, and a man named George Gray Barnard, who is an American sculptor who's shown on the right. Barnard was actually a sculptor who was trained in France in the studio of Rodin and worked primarily in things like marble. He had a tremendous appreciation for the achievements of medieval sculptors and what he referred to as the patient Gothic chisel. So his primary medium was stone. That is one of the major building materials of the Middle Ages and one of the major elements that's used in medieval art when you think about sculpted decoration. And so Barnard was a tremendous admirer of the work of these medieval artisans and felt strongly that there were things that they had to say to his own contemporary audiences, particularly artists who worked in that same material. He also was trying to supplement his own income as an artist. So when he was set up in France, he began traveling in the countryside into places like the foothills of the Pyrenees and the border between what's now France and Spain. And he began buying up elements of medieval art, sometimes from buildings themselves and sometimes from private individuals who had objects in their collection, and began to build up a significant collection himself that he then eventually started to sell to American institutions. The early 20th century was the great building moment for American museums. So you have many museums being created at that time that are actively seeking collections not just of medieval art, but collections from other parts of the world as well. Just to give you some sense of Barnard's own work as a sculptor, that's one object on the right that you can see called The Struggle Between the Two Natures of Man that he made in 1888 out of a single block of marble. That's now in the American wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And then this shot of Barnard with some of the sculptural elements that you'll be seeing later in the image in the background. So Barnard, I had mentioned, was assembling medieval art in the first decades of the 20th century in Europe. And by 1913, he had amassed a significant collection and decided to ship it to New York City, where he opened a private museum, which he called the Cloisters. And that museum was about 1.5 miles to the south of where the current Met Cloisters is located. The structure that I'm showing you here is a black and white image of that museum when it was first opened. Think of a brick-like structure with a greenhouse-style roof, and it was a very evocative installation. So he would often use candlelight and torches to light the sculptures. Sometimes the security staff would actually be dressed up in monk's cowls, and there was sometimes music piped in to give this very atmospheric, kind of evocative, romantic notion of medieval art. It really, at the same time, however, was cutting edge. This was the first institution, or first, in this case, private museum, to focus particularly on Western European art of the Middle Ages, and that's a legacy that continues in what's now a satellite of the Met. But the version that you're seeing here is Barnard's private museum called the Cloisters. Just to give you a shot of what the landscape that he created this museum looked like at the time, by the second decade of the 20th century, the northern part of the island of Manhattan was rapidly being developed. This was a moment when the subway line was starting to come up that way. Riverside Heights was already pretty significantly developed, and this is a neighborhood that we now refer to as Washington Heights, which takes its name from Fort Washington, which was the site of a Revolutionary-era fort in the same area. So that's Barnard's Cloisters down inside that image, inside the rectangle rather, with one cloister element located outside the building, and that's that form that you can see in white. We're going to take a closer look at that in a couple moments. This is what the landscape looked like by the time that Barnard had arrived. This is circa 1915, and at this moment, the second character, John D. Rockefeller Jr., who I already mentioned, doesn't yet know Barnard, but he's actually spending a lot of personal time up in this area of Manhattan because he used to ride horses up there when it looked this way. This was an area known as Fort Tryon Hill. It's now Fort Tryon Park. But Rockefeller was tremendously moved by the natural landscape and the vistas that still survive in this area, and really, I think, began thinking at that stage in his life, as a man in his early 20s, that this is land that should be protected if possible. There were a number of private estates that had already been created there, but he began really thinking this over in his mind at the same time that Barnard had created this private museum, which he opened, as I mentioned, shortly after 1913 when he ships his collections to New York. One of the great estates up there on the site was the Billings estate, and I'm just opening my computer now because it's gone to sleep. There we go. The Billings estate was created by someone we might refer to now, I suppose, as a robber baron, but this is the great moment of American industry. There's tremendous wealth being created. Rockefeller himself comes from a family that made its fortunes in Standard Oil with roots in Cleveland. Here on the Billings estate, this was a manor house, a mansion basically, created in this French chateau style. And it had pool, indoor squash courts, a bowling alley. There was even a landing for the private yacht on the Hudson River down at the base. But this gives you some sense of the landscape around the property that Barnard had purchased and where Rockefeller is now poking around. So one thing I wanted to mention in this slide, in this next slide, is that if you're looking around for remnants of these early structures, not many of them survive because Rockefeller ended up purchasing the land, as you'll hear, and some of them were torn down. The Billings estate actually burned in a fire in 1927. After Rockefeller had acquired it. But that one structure that I'm showing you in the lower right in the black and white image still survives. That's taken from the West Side Highway. So if you're ever driving just past the GW Bridge and you want to have a sense of what remains from this moment in the early 20th century, that's one example right there. I'm going to introduce now another character to the story whose name was William Bosworth. And Bosworth was an American architect who is probably most famous for his work on the campus of MIT, when he created that building that you're seeing on the right, which is at the very heart of their campus in Cambridge. It was the largest interior space created in a kind of neoclassical style at the moment. So Bosworth was an architect whose name and reputation was on the rise. He knew Rockefeller quite well, and Bosworth actually also knew George Gray Barnard. So he's kind of the connecting link between these figures that I'm outlining as part of the early history of the Cloisters. Rockefeller traveled in Europe in the wake of the First World War, and he was tremendously moved by the devastation that had been suffered during the war by not just the French people, but by the monuments that were so central to their identity. Places like Versailles, Fontainebleau, and here Reims Cathedral. And Rockefeller established a fund to support the restoration of these sites, and he appointed Bosworth to help administer these funds and to help in the supervision of the architectural work that would be needed to restore them. So Reims Cathedral, as it exists today, exists in the way that it does thanks to the work that Bosworth helped to oversee and to the funding provided through the Rockefeller Foundation. So you see an image of the cathedral shortly after the First World War on the upper left, and the cathedral as it stands today. That was damaged by shelling, but you can think of the damage that that Notre Dame in Paris suffered after that devastating fire now just 4 years ago, and the kind of the investment that's been made in restoring these great monuments of French identity and cultural heritage so that people can continue to enjoy them. Rockefeller definitely was thinking about these issues as the Cloisters is coming into focus. So they meet because Bosworth actually reaches out to Barnard, the sculptor, when Rockefeller was working on his family estate up the Hudson River in Kykuit. This is an aerial shot of Kykuit on the left and an outdoor fountain that Rockefeller commissioned from Barnard in around 1923. So Barnard had opened his private museum. It was operating as a private institution in the area of Washington Heights. Rockefeller had been spending time up there as a young man, knew the area very well, became connected to Bosworth, had this real interest in French cultural patrimony and its restoration, and then ends up becoming connected with Barnard because of work that he's doing on his family estate. This is where conversations begin between Barnard and Rockefeller about this private museum called the Cloisters, because Barnard at this moment is looking for a buyer. He's hoping to either move elements of the collection or have someone buy the museum and take over its management. The other thing that happens at this moment is Barnard informs Rockefeller that there are these amazing tapestries that are coming up for sale, and the year is 1922. And I'm just going to read you a quote from the letter he wrote. This is Barnard writing to Rockefeller. I have just seen the most beautiful and rare Gothic tapestries in existence. There is nothing equal to them in the Louvre or Cluny. It is eternal spring, living in the trees, flowers, and human figures. Their possession by you or our nation will be a thing of world interest and world histories. He's writing this because the tapestries by this point have appeared in New York. They're being offered for sale by a dealer. Rockefeller asked Bosworth to go have a look at them. And Bosworth responded to Rockefeller by saying that he definitely advises that Rockefeller should move on these tapestries. And so Rockefeller ends up purchasing them for $1.1 million, which was about $200,000 less than the asking price. So there never actually was a public gallery viewing because Rockefeller pounced as soon as he had had that affirmation from Bosworth, who reinforced Barnard's excitement about the tapestries. So they end up going to his private residence on Park Avenue, and that's where this picture comes from. So the Cloisters, the Unicorn Tapestries, Rockefeller, Barnard, Bosworth, all of these threads are beginning to come together in the third decade of the 20th century, so in the heart of the 1920s. So how does the Met become connected to the Cloisters? Well, Rockefeller agrees to fund the purchase of the Cloisters, the George Gray Barnard Cloisters, and to have them start operating as a branch museum of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So 1925, the Cloisters becomes a branch museum devoted to medieval art and architecture, run by the Metropolitan Museum of Art, with funding provided by John D. Rockefeller Jr. One thing that's interesting and important to note in this story is that at this moment that Rockefeller has funded this acquisition of a building and its collections and provided help to make sure that it can be run smoothly by the museum, he's also been buying up land in what would become Fort Tryon Park. I showed you that image of Fort Tryon Hill earlier. He was very committed to this, and this was a project over several decades, because as he wrote to his father, he was really convinced that this land could become an important public park for the city of New York. And so as Rockefeller makes this purchase, the museum begins operating the branch. He specifies to the board of the museum at the time that he's prepared to contribute the entire cost of a new building to occupy a site that he's established in accordance with plans acceptable to your board and to me. The idea being to suitably house, with the provision of reasonable growth, the medieval collection at present displayed at the Cloisters. I am also prepared to pay the expense of moving the Cloister collections and installing them in the new building. So it's not long after the Cloisters begins operating as a branch museum that Rockefeller engages the Olmsted landscaping architecture firm to begin designing what would become a public park. And in these initial designs, you can actually see that the Cloisters is integrated into the design. This is without any architectural work having happened. But the idea was to take the Cloisters, which was located right about here at the time, to make sure that this park is landscaped properly, and then to relocate the collections to a purpose-built building that would be evocative of the medieval architecture that it was meant to house. So this is a shot of the Cloisters in construction. So imagine that at this point, 1932 is when the building was starting into construction. It's the heart of the Great Depression. There's tremendous storm clouds gathering over Europe as we enter that period of Nazi domination that starts in 1933, the rise of the Nazi Socialist Party. And this project, funded by Rockefeller, is in many ways a kind of visionary dream. But the backdrop is the Great Depression and the gathering storm clouds of war in Europe. It opens in May of 1938. And I thought I'd just share briefly Rockefeller's remarks at the time of the opening, because that sense of what he hoped this space would achieve is something that we still hold on to this day. On the occasion of the opening, he remarked that if those who come under the influence of this place go out to face life with new courage and restored faith because of the peace, the calm, the loveliness they have found here, if the many who thirst for beauty are refreshed and gladdened as they drink deeply from this well of beauty, those who have builded here will not have built in vain. So in many ways, it's a very different place now. We have a different approach to programming, there are exhibitions, but this is actually a founding vision that we try to remain true to, that this is a place in a bustling city that allows people to feel like they have a place to escape, a place of refreshment, tranquility, solitude. It's not to say that we don't like to have our galleries lively, but the gardens and that mixture of indoor and outdoor spaces with these panoramic views around the Hudson River Valley, and then the surrounding parkland, which is about 70 acres, really does set a different kind of tone for the visit. I should also note that it's the only free place I'm aware of in New York where you can park without cost, so there's that too. Okay, so let's come to the tapestries. So to ground us a little bit, and I know that there are wonderful tapestries here in the Flint Museum in the Bray Gallery, I just wanted to give you a sense of, maybe today in the 21st century, tapestries feel like a very kind of old school art form. But in their own time, they were the kind of pinnacle of artistic production. They were commissioned by important patrons in part because of the labor and the amount of time that went into their production. So it's easy to think about tapestries as things that you might walk by quickly in a gallery now. But in their own day, they were really some of the most important art forms or works of art to be produced. I'm showing you here images now of painted scenes from illuminated manuscripts that give you some sense of how tapestries might have been used in context. This is a very famous image from an illuminated manuscript called the Tres Richeurs, which belonged to the brother of the King of France at the time, a man named Jean, Duc de Berry. And in this feasting scene from the month of January, you can see all of these nobles, these elite patrons have gathered in the presence of the Duke. He's depicted in this wonderful fur hat against the fire screen, giving out gifts and receiving gifts on the early part of the new year. And behind him, on the wall, are these great martial tapestries. It might be that these represent battles from antiquity. It might even be that they represent images from things like the stories of the Knights of King Arthur. But it's interesting to see that the tapestries themselves are extremely flexible. They create this amazing decoration, enveloping the room with narrative pictures, but they can also be easily adjusted to the space of the room itself. So note, for instance, how they've just been folded over where the great mantle of the fireplace comes out. The idea being that with many of these noble families, they might have multiple residences, so the tapestries are things that could work in different kinds of spaces. They were amazingly flexible. They're not easy to move, I'll grant that, but nevertheless, that sense in which the space itself and the tapestries can kind of be blended together at the same time that they envelop you in these wonderful epic stories is one of the ways in which they were designed to work. Here too, another image from a manuscript, in this case from a Spanish royal patron. And you can see how the tapestries bring this sense of eternal spring into these cold rooms of palatial palaces and manor houses and things like that. You can see how the hanging features from the wall allow the tapestries to hang down, and you've got these scenes of wonderful fountains and springtime, flowering plants, and lovers engaging with each other in these landscapes, these kind of pleasure gardens. These are what tapestries brought into some of these spaces. We don't actually have any what are called cartoons that were used in making tapestries to survive from the Middle Ages, but there are sets that survive from later periods. And I'm going to just say a little bit about this so that you get some sense of the process of making tapestries. The initial concept was done by an artist. So in this case, the artist was Raphael, the famous Renaissance Italian artist, and he designed these tapestries for the Sistine Chapel. He would make initial designs, working out the composition. When that composition was finalized, there would be a one-to-one mock-up on the scale of what the intended scale of the tapestry would be. And that's what served as the guide for the weavers who were executing the work of transforming that cartoon into, let's call it, a woven painting. They're using colored threads. Sometimes those threads are wrapped with silver and gold, and the dyes might be a mixture, well, they're mostly plant-based dyes, but the threads themselves might be wool. Sometimes they're silk if they're very expensive tapestries. But so you have an artist who does the original design. There are model books that survive from the Middle Ages, and I'm showing you one here, that were created to provide a variety of different designs that patrons could choose from in the creation of tapestries. The Unicorn Tapestries are definitely highly customized, so it's not as if they were like looking at designs that already existed and picking one and then having that made into a set of tapestries. But there's early evidence that survives that gives us an insight into how this work was done. There's also artists that, although we might not have their names, we can identify the works that they were responsible for, because usually an artist worked in a range of different materials. They didn't specialize in creating designs for tapestries. They might do books of hours. They might do engraved decoration for metalwork. And so in the case of the Unicorn Tapestries, although we don't know the name of the artist who was responsible for their designs, we do know that it was likely an artist working in Paris who was responsible for creating other kinds of objects. The Book of Hours that you're seeing on the left is the so-called Curver Hours, and on the right is a work in the Met's collections that's been attributed to the same artist. How do we know this? It's because they would repeat their designs and their compositions. So if you look at the unicorn being given chase by the hunting party, and I'm going to get back to the narrative in a little while, you can sense that some of these characters are actually taken out of other kinds of artistic production that this artist was doing. One example of that is taking a more in-depth look at the Book of Hours on the right. You can see that I've highlighted in this rectangle one of the figures that's responsible for the kind of participating in the martyrdom of St. John the Evangelist. And he's highlighted in that blue, and you can see the same figure, on the left there. So this is definitely an artist who is repurposing his composition and his designs. He also did work for stained glass artists. So this figure on the right, who's participating in the taking of Christ to Calvary and the way to the crucifixion, is just like the hunter figure that you see on the left. They also would sometimes use templates to speed up the work. Tapestry production is incredibly time intensive. So they would sometimes use figures and just repeat them. So something like a dog's head might appear the same way in one tapestry in the set, and you can find it in the second in another tapestry in the set. So as you move from that design work to the actual execution, this is where it gets to be, where you get some understanding of why this work is so time intensive. Each individual color that you see in the tapestry is a different colored thread. That means that every one of those threads had to be dyed. Those dye batches had to be monitored so that you had consistency in one dye to another. Oftentimes there were women involved in this part of the process. And then the weavers themselves, sitting at their looms, would take those bobbins with the colored thread over, under, over, under, over, under. They'd change the thread out when it was a different color. And they would be using the tapestry design, the cartoon, as a guide to their work. So one tapestry, if you have a team of weavers, might take months to complete. A whole set might take as many as a few years to complete. So that gives you some sense as to why they were so highly prized and so expensive. So the unicorn and these tapestries are especially important because they use not just the dyed wool that I was talking about, but some of the threads are wrapped with silver and gold. So you have a resplendent, reflective quality in some of the decorations. So imagine this detail that I'm showing you of the unicorn in captivity. The edges of the wooden fencing around the unicorn are actually silver thread. So imagine that glimmering in the torchlight or the candlelight of an interior space where this is put on view. So what's actually happening in these tapestries, and what can we say about what they mean? If we understand and appreciate now a little bit more in depth why, how they were made and the process, what do we actually know about the tapestries themselves? Well, if you come to the cloisters now, you'll see them on view in this space. They've been given a dedicated gallery where you're really enveloped as a visitor in this whole set of tapestries. We actually don't know who created them. We only know that they were made around the year 1500. I mentioned that we've been able to identify the anonymous artist who was responsible for the designs. But they don't really appear in any documents until the early 18th century. And it's at that time that they are connected to a chateau that belonged to the Rockefeller family. They're listed in 1728 inventory, and they are listed as being in this chateau. This is on the outside of Paris. By that time, they were almost 200 years old, right? So we don't have a sense of what happened to them in the intervening years or whether this family was connected to their original owners. As you might know, during the French Revolution, there was a tremendous amount of destruction of property. Heads of sculptures, people lost their heads, right? Sculptures with crowns on them also lost their heads. But also in places like these great power centers that belonged to wealthy aristocratic families, there was a tremendous amount of destruction as well. And so in 1793, that chateau was sacked. The rioters set fire to the chateau itself, and the tapestries were stolen. They don't reemerge until the 1850s. So at that point, they were rediscovered in a nearby peasant's house who was using them to cover the vegetables in his barn. But they did survive, amazingly. So they are returned to the family, And there's a record of their having been on view in a salon in the chateau in 1856. And then they disappear until they reemerge on the market. So a dealer obtains them and then ends up selling them to John D. Rockefeller Jr., and this is the shot that I showed you earlier on of the tapestries when they were used in the Rockefeller family residence. Just before the cloisters opened, this was on the cusp of the opening in 1938, Rockefeller ended up giving the tapestries to the Metropolitan Museum of Art as a gift, and that's where they now reside. This is a shot of the gallery when it was created, just as the cloisters was opening for the first time after that new construction. And this space has now been divided into two because the Heroes Tapestries arrived a little bit later, and I'll finish by telling you about the Heroes Tapestries at the end of the talk. But this is what they look like when they were first presented at the cloisters. So, what do they mean? And how do we understand them? How do we begin to appreciate them from our vantage point in the 21st century? The whole set were clearly connected to each other for reasons that I'll go into in a moment. But I want to point out that there are two different approaches taken to the composition in the tapestries. One is what's called the mille fleurs composition, which is 1,000 flowers. So you have this resplendent field of growing flora where it's spring all the time. Flowers that don't bloom together are blooming together in the tapestries. So tapestries do things in art that aren't possible in nature, but they create these kind of resplendent settings. So the mille fleurs approach is actually an earlier tapestry form of decoration that goes all the way back to the end of the 13th century. And it's the unicorn in captivity and the hunters departing for their quest for the unicorn that use this approach to the composition. The other tapestries in the set take an entirely different approach to the composition, what we might view as more anchored in the Renaissance, where there is really a sense of a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. There's some sense that figures are occupying space. It might be layered and built up, but nevertheless it represents a different kind of paradigm in how the artist approaches the depiction of space. So this is the group that's at the cloisters. Some of you might be wondering, there's another Lady in the Unicorn set somewhere else, and there is a set in Paris, completely separate from this one, but they were produced around the same time. So I'm focused now on the tapestries in New York at the Met Cloisters. And you can read them in a narrative way. And so I thought I'd just take you through the set in that fashion. But the reason I want to make sure that people understand that we know that they were definitely connected to each other, even though there are these two different approaches, is because every single one of the tapestries incorporates this A and backwards E, a monogram, that was presumably connected to their original owners. There's some debate still about what that might represent, if it's a reference to a family, or maybe two families that were joined in marriage, or maybe even Adam and Eve, as I'll come back to. But you can see that A and E appearing throughout this first tapestry in the sequence. And sometimes you'll even, if you look closely, see it appearing on dog collars in the hunting dogs. So this is where the hunters are setting off on their quest. And they're setting off not just to chase after something like a stag or a boar, they are after a unicorn, this mythical creature. And one of the hunters has disappeared already deep into the forest, and he's calling to his companions from the upper left part of the composition. Hey, I'm here. Come. So into the forest the hunting party goes, and they discover the unicorn. This is not just any forest. First of all, it has a fountain in the middle of it. In some of the other images, you'll also see glimpses of castles. So this is actually a very contemporary evocation of aristocratic land practices around things like castles, where the ruling nobility would control land and they would create hunting parks. Those hunting parks were populated with stags, boars, and other kinds of animals that were used for their pleasure and their benefit. They employed people who worked these forests as hunters. So think of like two groups of society represented in these tapestries. There's the working huntsmen, who are the people that are being paid by and put up and owe their allegiance to the aristocrats, and then there's the aristocratic hunting party itself. So what we're actually looking at is an evocation of this kind of private estate where you have these pleasure gardens and these hunting forests that are controlled by the nobility. And they've come together around this fountain in the presence of the unicorn. And it's this moment where everything has kind of frozen because the unicorn is performing this magical act of pushing its horn down into the waters to purify them. And you have these creatures that have gathered around the unicorn. Not woodland creatures all, because you have a mixture of creatures that would have been found in these woodland forests with creatures that come from the continent of Africa and even further away. This is the moment when royal menageries are not unusual. So you'd have aristocrats not only creating these lands, these hunting parks, but sometimes they would even have collections of exotic animals. So in this instance, what's important to mention is that these creatures are gathered together in harmony and in peace. Those that would normally be prey and hunters are gathered together in this kind of magic moment with the unicorn. And it's a dazzling moment also just from a technical point of view. I think I might have a detail here. Yes. Look at the pheasant who's looking down into the rippling waters of that fountain and seeing his own reflection in colored thread. That's an amazingly virtuosic demonstration of the tapestry weaver's skills. And then it's also interesting to see that here the waters are still, but after the fountain pours its waters down and the unicorns stir them up, you have the sense of ripples in the current of the fountain itself. And this stream is actually a unifying theme of the composition of some of the subsequent scenes. So the hunters are debating now. Here's the unicorn. What do we do? How are we going to capture it and kill it? So this is where the hunt ensues. And here you have the hunters surrounding the unicorn behaving much like a stag, jumps through this stream, right? This effort to throw off the scent of the dogs. But I mention this because the weapons that they're using and the visual language that this tapestry is speaking is incredibly contemporary for the year 1500. The people who would have been in spaces with this tapestry not long after it was created would have read this through that lens. They would have gone on stag hunts. So the language that it's speaking must have felt very, very close to them, very contemporary, even though it's a mythical creature in this mythical chase. So if any of you know anything about unicorns, you can't overcome a unicorn by sheer force alone. So the unicorn is incredibly powerful. Here it's defending itself. You can see this really grisly detail of the dog's belly being opened by the horn of the unicorn. The unicorn is definitely capable of defending itself in a situation like this. The unicorn can only be defeated and conquered, according to legend, if you send a maiden out into the forest. And that's the episode that I'm going to come to in a moment. What you might notice here is that it feels like the same scene we are looking at, but it's in reverse. Why would I throw that slide in? Well, I wanted you to see that on the back side of the tapestry, you actually get a much more vivid sense of the colors, and they're that much closer to their original because the backside has not been exposed to sunlight over centuries and centuries of time. So if you want to get some sense of how vivid these must have felt in their own time, it's by looking at the backs of the tapestries that we can tell that. So I mentioned here the contemporary language of the hunt. This is the manuscript from Chantilly again. In this case, it's a boar hunt. But imagine that if you're used to going out, and this is the kind of royal or aristocratic pastime that you engage in, how close that hunt for the unicorn must have felt. So here's where the maiden comes in. Because according to legend, it's only a maiden, i.e. a virgin, that goes out into the forest, and it's at that moment that the unicorn will reveal itself and give itself up to this young maiden, kind of relinquish itself. And that's the moment that the hunters have been waiting for in that what's now a fragment of a larger tapestry. But you can see the right arm of the maiden, and I don't know if you can see it from the back, but there's a thumb and a few fingers just gently brushing the mane of the unicorn. That's the remains of her right hand. She was coming around to embrace the unicorn. And then it's that figure in red who might look like she's waving out at us, but she's actually waving and giving the signal to the hunters because now's the moment that they can strike. So to give you some sense of how that imagery turns up in surviving compositions, this is the side of an ivory casket at the cloisters, and on the right edge here, you can see the maiden in the forest, the unicorn putting its head down in her lap, and then the hunter has already pierced him with a sword. So it's hard, I think, for us to understand, many of us like unicorns. I like unicorns. Why all this effort to kill the creature? Well, there are two thoughts about this, because here in this last episode in the tapestry, you can see the unicorn is finally succumbing to its wounds, the coup de grace being delivered here with this great spear, and then the body of the unicorn slumped over is being delivered to this lord and lady. One theory is that for contemporary theologians, the unicorn was sometimes thought of as a personification of Christ. So this can be read as a Christian allegory, that there is this hunt that ensues, the unicorn is eventually killed, but it then rises again, and you have that iconic image of the unicorn in this Edenic garden surrounded by that little fence with the collar on his neck. And then through that lens, perhaps the A and the E might be a reference to Adam and Eve, and that's kind of a current that runs through the story. The other thing that people argue, the other reason that people argue for this, is that, I don't know if you can see it, but the blood that's dripping down out of the wound lines up perfectly with the hunter's horn. So there's this kind of Eucharistic moment in the death of the unicorn, where the blood can be thought about as the blood of Christ and its consumption by the hunter. The other way of thinking about this is not through a religious lens at all, but rather through the lens of courtly poetry, because the unicorn also plays a really important place in the language of courtly love that's being created at the end of the 13th century and all the way through the Middle Ages. I mean, in some ways, that's the legacy of the stories that you're seeing in the Bray galleries here, with that great epic story of the conquest of Jerusalem. So I'm just going to read you a quote from one of the poets who writes about the unicorn, because the unicorn in this context emblematizes the lover who gives himself up completely to his beloved. He writes, and this is actually from the early 13th century, "The unicorn and I are one. He also pauses in amaze before some maiden's magic gaze, and while he wonders is undone. On some dear breath he slumbers deep, and treason slays him in that sleep. Just so have ended my life's days. So love, my lady, lay me low. My heart will not survive this blow." So that sense of the heart being pierced and that kind of sweet pain of love that you give yourself up completely to your beloved might also underline how we could understand these tapestries. So through that lens, one of the things that's interesting to note in closing with this set is that the unicorn in captivity, or the unicorn enclosed in the garden, actually operates against this backdrop of about 70 different specific plant species. They're rendered with such particularity that botanists have been able to identify at least 70 different plants depicted in the unicorns. Many of them, according to medieval botanists and literature, connect to themes of love and fertility. So having seen the hunt and the violence of those images, it's easy to think that the red marks on the back of the unicorn are remnants of what he's just been through. But in fact, that's the ripe juice of the pomegranate that's dripping down from the tree above. And the pomegranate is definitely one of the emblems of love. This is the fruit that Persephone eats from, and as a result spends 6 months out of the year in Hades. And when she returns, her mother celebrates, and that's why we have the ushering in of spring once again. So it's, what makes these tapestries so interesting is that although we know a great deal about how they were made, we don't necessarily know why they were brought into being or how they might have been interpreted in this moment. But there are definitely two different ways of thinking about them. So I'm going to close, and this is going to be a little bit faster because I want to give you a current view of something that's happening with the Heroes Tapestries, which is the second set of important tapestries at the Cloisters. And as I mentioned, they were actually presented at the Cloisters following its opening after the acquisition of the Unicorn Tapestries in a room that was segmented out of the room that the Unicorn Tapestries were originally displayed in. So here we are in the Heroes Gallery, and you can see through here the doorway, and through that door is one shot of actually the unicorn defending itself. It's that grisly detail of the horn goring the dog. So the Heroes Tapestries are about 100 years earlier than the Unicorn Tapestries. It's incredibly rare to have an ensemble of tapestries survive from that time period. There's only one other place in France where you can see a set on that scale, and that's in Angers, not so far outside of Paris towards the Normandy coast. There was one of these tapestries in the Cloisters collection, in the Met collections, in 1932 that had been acquired as a single object, a figure of King Arthur that I'll show you in a moment. But after the Cloisters opened, about 10 years later, 1947, these came on the market. And it was a whole set of tapestries devoted to the theme of the heroes. The idea was that you'd have three important heroes from three major epochs in human history. The first was the pagan heroes, the heroes of Roman antiquity, Hector of Troy, Alexander the Great, and Julius Caesar. The second set of heroes, come from the Hebrew Bible. Joshua, David, and Judas Maccabeus, the leader of the Israelite army. And then finally, Christian heroes, King Arthur, Charlemagne, and sometimes Godfrey de Bouillon. So here you want to imagine yourself, why would an elite patron want these images of great heroes? It's so that they have role models around them when they're making important decisions of great leaders from the past, from these different traditions that they're drawing from. So you have these classical Hebrew and Christian heroes taken from legend, and there would have been one tapestry devoted to each one of these figures in the original set. We know of the interest in these stories from this great romance that was created in the early 14th century called The Vows of the Peacock. And in this text, these great leaders are framed within this context of chivalric literature and romance. And they thought in terms of triads, right? These great men, they were considered paradons of chivalry within their particular traditions, whether pagan, Jewish, or Christian. So we have manuscripts that speak to this tradition, and now we know that there were monumental painting traditions as well as tapestry traditions. The set that survives at the Cloisters are the only ones we have. So we've got the images that I'm showing you here labeled, so we have a few of the heroes missing, but it still remains one of the largest surviving ensembles of the time. The one thing to mention, and I'm going to get into this in detail in a moment, is that King Arthur was already in the collection. So that had a separate collecting history. It was purchased by the Met in the early 30s. It's the other groups in the set that people became so excited about when they hit the market in 1947. They survived because they too had a different past, like a storied history. By the time they were rediscovered, they were actually being used as curtains. They had been cut up into different elements, and they were being used as curtains in a chateau that belonged to a French family, the Martin Vast family. So one of the early challenges when these acquisitions were made was to take 94 pieces, like a giant jigsaw puzzle, and try and figure out which elements of which tapestry went with which hero, including King Arthur. So the work that was done by James Rorimer, who was a curator at the Cloisters at the time, and a woman named Margaret Freeman, who worked with him on this project, and a group of women who were hired to do the work, the weaving work, required to reassemble these great tapestries. You can see them doing the work on the bench there on the left. They were completed and eventually put on installation a year later, 1948. I love this poster. The first public exhibition since the Middle Ages. It's a great poster. So here's how they're presented now. And I'm going to conclude by showing you some of the work that's really quite current on what we've been doing to restore the tapestry of King Arthur, because we've embarked on a multi-year project to restore this group of tapestries, which is really in need of attention. They haven't been significantly treated since that moment that I shared you, their first exhibition since the Middle Ages. So conserving King Arthur, and this is going to be the last part of the talk and shorter than the unicorns. So King Arthur, when he first entered the collection, simply represented that rectangular tapestry that you see at the bottom. Those other elements that came from the curtains were able to be added in thanks to the addition of the tapestries, all of this with funding from John D. Rockefeller Jr., who took a real interest in the project. So before conservation, this is what the tapestry looked like. You have the 1947 acquisition highlighted up above and the 1932 acquisition down below. Well, one of the first issues with tapestries is you can get chemical changes. This begins to happen almost immediately, right? The colors begin to fade. Ironically, the medieval colors, which are based on plant dyes, are very stable and long-lasting. Some of the unicorn tapestries were redone in the 19th century using artificial dyes, modern dyes, and those are actually brown now. Whereas the medieval dyes, many of them still preserve their colors. But nevertheless, in this comparison of front and back, you get some sense of the degradation in color that happens. So that's one thing that you can't really address it, but you can slow it down. The second is mechanical changes. Tapestries are very heavy. So the longer they're on view without attention, just hanging from the top, the more that work of gravity will do its work, and you can have things separating and the tapestries becoming structurally less stable. And then finally, the last thing that you want to try to address is soil and soot and the accumulation of years of grime, whether it's candle soot or grime and dirt that's accumulated. So I'm just showing you a zoomed in image to give you a sense of how tenacious the soil can be in hanging on to threads. Obviously, one of the biggest enemies of tapestries is moths, insects. So we have a very active pest management program. So the first step in treating a tapestry like this is to get it off the wall. And so here you really do need a team of people. In the case of the cloisters, the tapestries are presented on these hard frames. They're aluminum frames so that they can be easily moved around and modified. There's backing on the tapestries to help to provide a little additional structure behind. But we need to take this tapestry, we needed to take it down to the Met Fifth Avenue. So it's about 7 miles to the south. So it needed to be packed and shipped down to the main museum where the conservation facilities to treat the work exist. So that's the work that's underway here. You can see it being loaded into a truck at the cloisters. This is about 2 years before the pandemic. And then actually before it goes into the Met's main collections areas, it goes through what's called an anoxic treatment. So you wrap the tapestry and you starve it of oxygen to ensure that any chance that there's insect infestation in there, that's what you're doing. You're getting rid of any possibility of spores or things like that are germinating. That could then be a real issue as this tapestry is brought into a collection where there are other textiles. So that's the anoxic treatment that's happening. The next step is documentation. It's really important and helpful to get as high resolution images as you can to not only document the state of condition of the work that you're about to, of the tapestry before you start the work, but actually the conservators can do a tremendous amount of analytical work using these high-res images before they even start working on the object itself. So because of its scale, this requires a special setup. And I'm just going to show you here this image, which is speeded up of the work that was done to provide the images. So here you see the image capture frame by frame. These large images are then tiled together into a single image. You're getting the front, now you're getting the back. Same process, front to back, and then the tapestry is rolled up for the last stage in the process before treatment can begin. Here you can see the image tiles being reassembled, and this is really what guides the work of the conservators as they approach the project. Then it's time to wash it. You actually, in this case, one of the ways of dealing with the grime is that the tapestry had a bath. And so here you're seeing the tapestry laid out in this structure in a big area that can be drained. They built up the walls around this, think of like a kid's bath or those little blow-up things that you've got in your yard. That's basically what they've done here. Oh, I went past that one too fast. And then they bathe it. using a very gentle cleaning solution. They've already pre-tested it to make sure there's no running of the dyes. And so this happens, they agitate the water, they drain, they do the same thing, agitate, drain, they do it a few times just over the course of a single day. And then the tapestry is laid out to dry. It does change its shape a little bit when this happens because things kind of tighten up. But it's at that moment that it's ready to be put on the workbench. And here it's really at the Met that I have tremendously skilled colleagues who took on the work of reinforcing the structure, so getting in and making sure that any broken elements in the weft, which is the load-bearing part of the tapestry, are dealt with. And then they actually begin to think about, are there elements of the tapestry that should be rewoven? If there are elements of the composition that are critical to reading the overall image, then it's a conversation between the curators and the conservators about how far you want to go with that work. These are highly trained individuals who are often, do long internships in this kind of work. There aren't many places in the world where people are trained, so it's we're very fortunate at the Met to have a group of at least 3 people who do this work for our department. And here you can see the work that they're doing. This took about 2 years with some interruptions by the pandemic. And I just want to give you some before and after. So before treatment on the left, after treatment on the right. I'm going to hone in. You can hopefully see a difference in the color a little bit, but I'm going to hone in on some of the details where there's been restoration work. So we focused in particular on the crowns for King Arthur, and they did some reintegrated weaving using dyes that are specifically tested to try and match the colors as closely as possible. And there are other elements. I mean, we didn't take on the whole thing because we have other tapestries that we wanted to move on to, but we wanted to reintegrate some of the more central parts of the composition. So here you've got the before and after highlighted so you can see it, and then maybe a little bit of an easier image. This is the structural part of the tapestry, and it's this that you're weaving in and out, over, under, over, under. That's called the weft, which carries the color. And then finally, you put on a new backing. So you're helping to stabilize the tapestry as much as possible. So the load of gravity on the tapestry isn't being borne just by that top element, but it's a bit better distributed. And then it goes back on the wall. So this is from last June, and now this figure of Julius Caesar is in the lab, and he's going through a similar process. So we're hoping that over the course of the next 10 years, the Heroes Tapestries will all be treated and back on view. And in the meantime, we have an opportunity to think about exhibitions and research and publication around this material. And with that, I'm going to bring things to a close, and I want to thank you all for being such attentive and generous audience, and I'm happy to field questions. Thank you very much.